What's up guys, it's me, Jeremy. So a lot of you guys can tell, I'm sure, not too long ago, Blizzard made the decision to separate the constructed formats into Standard and Wild separately a while back. Now they made it pretty clear that Standard was going to be the main competitive format, and the one that they really want to support. It definitely makes sense, since it helps Blizzard sell the new cards, keeps the ladder tournaments fresh and balanced, and is definitely a lot better for new players too. Still though, the fact that Wild is in the game means that it is definitely a format that some people play and some people definitely enjoy, which brings us to the question: should Blizzard balance cards in Wild, especially if the format gets too out of control? Now while the answer might seem like an obvious yes, there's definitely arguments and merits for both sides, so let's take a look at it. First off, we gotta take a look at what Wild represents as a format. And it's potentially easy to compare Wild to something like maybe Vintage in Magic the Gathering if you've ever played that before, since both are formats where really just all the cards are in the game and are allowed, and both serve two basic purposes. They let players who got into the game early still enjoy playing later on with some of the cards they got to play way back before. And they let players looking to play with really powerful cards do that as well. Now the obvious difference here is that Magic's been around forever, and so their oldest format has built just a massive card base, whereas in Hearthstone the Wild format isn't really all that much broken compared to in Standard, but logically speaking, as more and more Hearthstone expansions come out, Wild decks are just going to get better and better, since you get access to more cards, it's going to allow you for stronger decks. So it's pretty safe to say that the power difference between Standard and Wild is only going to keep growing until Wild becomes this just absolutely ridiculous format, while Standard remains about the same as time goes on. So essentially Wild will eventually get more and more powerful until the point where one or maybe even just a few decks are insanely strong and everything else becomes pretty much unplayable. So getting more into patches and balancing, Blizzard can balance Wild both directly and indirectly, actually. So one fairly easy way to balance it indirectly is simply to release new cards that are really strong in the decks in Wild that are maybe a little bit too weak, or to release cards that counter existing decks in Wild that are really strong. Now there are a few problems with this though. So first of all, while releasing stronger cards might potentially balance the format a bit better, it doesn't actually make the decks weaker, it kind of just raises the strength of other decks, and so overall makes the format even more powerful. Direct counters to cards also are not really a perfect solution, since tech cards can be a little bit unreliable if you maybe don't draw them, or maybe if they don't fit well in your deck, and Wild tends to be a really fast format due to the overall power level of the cards in general. The other problem, of course, is that Blizzard printing really powerful cards or some really insane tech cards can just totally warp Standard altogether, and obviously Blizzard definitely wants to avoid ruining their favorite format to balance their less favorite one. In fact, it's actually probably the opposite, because any nerfs that happen in Standard end up affecting Wild a lot actually, while any nerfs that happen to cards only in Wild would have no effect on Standard, of course. Now some people might think that these nerfs are probably a good thing for Wild because hey, nerfs and stuff equals balance, right? But not exactly. Because Standard nerfs are based on the Standard format, and format warping cards in Standard that need nerfs might not even be playable in Wild, or maybe Blizzard nerfs a card that would make sense to nerf in Standard, but that nerf completely destroys the balance of Wild. And this is a problem that is actually very unique to Hearthstone and other electronic card games with multiple formats, since paper card games generally don't change cards, they just ban them out from a certain format. It'll be really interesting to see how Blizzard actually deals with this if it does become a problem, but that is a different topic entirely. So since balancing Wild indirectly is actually very riddled with problems, we definitely need to take a look at the merits and the problems of Blizzard balancing Wild directly with buffs and nerfs to actual cards. So the merits of balancing Wild are essentially really just the merits of balancing any card game directly. The developers get to make changes that will balance out the game a little bit better, potentially make a lot of decks viable, creating potentially a more fun and diverse format. It also means that Blizzard can make a lot riskier decisions when it comes to releasing cards, since they can always just change them later down the road. It also means that Blizzard has to do a little bit less internal testing on the Wild format, because if they set a precedent for actually balancing it, it's not really going to matter all that much if they let some super crazy OP deck slip through the cracks, because they can just nerf it, right? Now, that all sounds pretty great, but there are definitely a few problems with this. First of all, Wild is played vastly less than Standard, so much less, it's crazy. And even almost all the tournaments in Hearthstone are played in the Standard format or some variation of the Standard format if you take a look at Firebat's tournament for example, and the majority of streamers and content creators pretty much almost all play on Standard. I mean, when was the last time we used Wild footage in one of our videos? Since there's less of a drive for players to play the format competitively because there's no tournaments or points for finishing well in a ladder, and as well, a lot of people just don't have the money to build a deck for Wild. Moreover, a lot of old school players already have all the cards they need to play for Wild, and since they buy new cards for Standard that they would have bought anyway, Blizzard definitely does make a lot less money off of the Wild format, which essentially does mean that there's little to no incentive for them to devote any development resources to the Wild format, so they likely do a lot less testing on it, and they certainly don't care about balancing it as much. The other problem is that players might not even be that satisfied if Blizzard decides to balance Wild. You know, people who want a fairly balanced meta can just go and play Standard, which Blizzard will, at least so far, make an effort to keep somewhat balanced. Whereas people that want to play completely degenerate or just ridiculous decks go play in the Wild format in the first place. The Wild community is going to be the kind of players that generally like to play with the more broken stuff, and they would probably be upset if it was potentially changed to make things a lot less broken. The final problem with balancing Wild is that Blizzard might not actually need to at all, honestly. You know, we did talk earlier about how more and more cards are going to lead to eventually a few dominant decks, but after a certain point, even more cards can actually open up the path to format diversity. You know, let's imagine that at some point far into the future, there's a combo deck in Wild that kills opponents on turn 6 super consistently, and it's just like the best deck in the format, and after 10 expansions and a lot more cards get released, there's now 3 decks that can kill on turn 6 consistently. And you know, after 10 more expansions, maybe there's 4 decks that can compete with that, but only 3 of them have like a good way to stop the combo. After 100 more expansions, maybe there's infinite decks that kill on turn 5 or something, but also decks that are fairly inconsistent and can kill on turn 4, and decks that lose to everything else but could beat those combo decks and stuff. Now, of course, these are just ridiculous explorations, but the general point is that while a certain deck might be dominant for one certain expansion, the decks in Wild do only get better and better, so the format can kind of balance itself through power creep almost. And it's pretty much to Blizzard's advantage to let it do so, really, since they get to devote their resources to Standard, but also keep the less played format moderately playable. Sure, there's probably a doomsday scenario eventually that might happen for a certain period of time where enough expansions come out that Wild is just so broken that maybe whoever goes first just wins every time, but not only is that period in time ridiculously far away from today, but also Blizzard can just step in at that point and then ban and nerf a bunch of stuff or something. Or maybe after that many expansions, there'll be a ton of different formats in addition to Wild with varying amounts of cards, and they'll be okay with just letting Wild stay broken. All in all, Blizzard definitely could balance Wild a little bit from time to time, and I gotta say most players probably wouldn't mind too much, but the resources they have to put in versus the actual benefit of balancing the format does make it seem unlikely that Blizzard will balance Wild at all. Not to mention that as we get more cards in the hundreds, even in the thousands, the format becomes increasingly more and more difficult to balance in the first place, and Blizzard are going to have to devote more and more time to balancing it at all. And so I can't say for sure if Blizzard should balance cards in Wild, but we can say that Standard's probably going to be balanced fairly frequently or as needed, while Wild is probably going to remain untouched for the most part, at least for the near future. But who knows, anything could definitely happen. Either way though, those are some of our thoughts and comments on balancing the Wild format in general. Definitely let us know what you think in the comments section below. Either way though, looks like that's going to be it from me. If you guys enjoyed the video, drop a like, subscribe if you want. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.